The smiles were still there. The cameras were still flashing. But something had changed, and it changed fast. What if I told you that the British monarchy didn't just lose patience with Meghan Markle, but finally decided she had crossed a line that could no longer be ignored? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Not whispered about, not managed behind the scenes, not smoothed over with polite silence. A line that forced King Charles to act, quietly, decisively, and without apology. Because when the palace moves this way, it doesn't leak first. It doesn't warn. It simply lets the consequences appear and lets the world catch up later. So ask yourself this. If everything was truly fine behind closed doors, why would the phrase, "no title for you," suddenly start circulating among royal watchers? And why now? That's the question that changes everything. For years, the public narrative has been simple. Too simple. Meghan speaks. The palace stays silent. Headlines explode. And eventually, the story fades. But this time, the silence feels different. Sharper. More deliberate. Almost like the calm before something permanent. Because this story isn't about hurt feelings. It's not about interviews. It's not even about popularity. It's about behavior. Boundaries. And the one thing the monarchy will protect at all costs: control. Let's rewind for a moment. The British royal family has survived wars, scandals, abdications, divorces, betrayals, and global humiliation. It bends. It absorbs. It waits people out. And that's why this moment matters. Because institutions that survive by waiting only stop waiting when the risk becomes existential. So what changed? Publicly, nothing dramatic happened overnight. There was no single headline screaming final straw. No dramatic announcement from Buckingham Palace. And that's exactly why insiders say this moment is more serious than anything before. Because real royal discipline doesn't come with press releases. It comes with absence. Absence from plans. Absence from permissions. Absence from recognition. Titles aren't just honorifics. They are access cards. They determine who gets invited, who gets acknowledged, who gets defended when the headlines turn ugly, and more importantly, who doesn't. For a long time, Meghan benefited from ambiguity. From being adjacent to royalty without being fully accountable to its rules. But here's the uncomfortable truth few people like to admit. The monarchy doesn't care if you're loved. It doesn't even care if you're hated. What it cannot tolerate is unpredictability in public behavior. Because unpredictability threatens hierarchy. And hierarchy is the monarchy's oxygen. Ask yourself this. Why do you think the palace tolerated far worse scandals in the past? Affairs. Financial embarrassments. Explosive divorces. Because those scandals stayed contained. They didn't redefine the institution itself. What's different now is the stage. Global platforms. Constant visibility. Narratives that don't fade, they multiply. Every appearance becomes a message. Every silence becomes an interpretation. Every gesture becomes a statement, whether intended or not. And that's where the tension reached a breaking point. Sources close to royal watchers say concern wasn't sparked by one interview or one appearance, but by a pattern. A pattern of public behavior that blurred lines. The monarchy depends on being crystal clear. Neutrality. Restraint. Hierarchy. The monarchy doesn't compete in the marketplace of opinions. It exists above it. Or at least, it must appear to. And when someone repeatedly pulls the institution into personal branding, public narratives, or perceived power plays, that's when alarms go off. Now let's talk about King Charles. Because this isn't the impulsive decision of a hot-headed ruler. Charles is cautious. Painfully cautious. He waited decades for the crown. He endured ridicule, scandal, and personal sacrifice. And that patience shaped how he rules. Which is why people misunderstand him. They mistake restraint for weakness. Silence for indecision. But here's what history teaches us. When King Charles finally decides, he does it with permanence. This isn't a man who enjoys confrontation. It's a man who avoids it until avoidance becomes dangerous. And insiders suggest that moment arrived quietly, without drama, when advisors began framing Meghan's public behavior not as a personal issue, but as a risk management problem. That's a chilling shift. Because once someone becomes a risk to the institution, compassion takes a back seat. This isn't about whether Meghan is right or wrong. It's about whether her presence, symbolic or literal, destabilizes the structure. And from the monarchy's perspective, Perception is reality. Let me ask you something. Why do you think the palace never corrects narratives quickly? Because ambiguity gives them control. But when ambiguity starts working against them, when it feeds chaos instead of stability, control must be reasserted. That's where titles come in. A title isn't a gift. It's a leash. It signals who speaks for the crown and who does not. And according to whispers growing louder by the day, King Charles is no longer comfortable with that leash being tugged in public. Which leads us to the phrase that has royal watchers on edge. No title for you. That doesn't necessarily mean a dramatic stripping tomorrow. It means something subtler and more effective. No elevation. No reinforcement. No protection. A slow fade out of legitimacy. Because the monarchy rarely destroys. It erases. An erasure is far more powerful than punishment. So why act now? Because timing matters. The monarchy is entering a consolidation phase. Slimmer. Tighter, more controlled. Every public-facing figure must serve a purpose, and every action must reinforce the hierarchy. Anything that distracts from that mission becomes expendable, and Meghan, whether intentionally or not, has become a lightning rod. But here's the part no one wants to talk about. This decision, if it truly has been made, doesn't just affect Meghan. It affects Harry. It affects future access. It affects how history remembers this era. Because once the palace mentally moves someone from family problem to institutional risk, there is no going back. Not with apologies. Not with silence. Not with time. And that's why this moment feels different. Not loud. Not explosive. Final. But this is only the surface. Because what really triggered this shift wasn't just public behavior. It was the rule that behavior allegedly broke. An unwritten rule. Older than the monarchy's press office. Stronger than public sympathy. And once that rule is crossed, the palace doesn't argue. It prepares. Because what came next wasn't a reaction. It was a strategy. And when we uncover that strategy, who proposed it, who supported it, and who stayed silent, the entire story changes. Because the next move wasn't about Meghan at all. It was about the future of the monarchy itself. And once you see that, you'll never read another headline the same way again. But what happened behind that closed door, the meeting that shifted everything, is where this story truly begins. That's the question no one outside the palace was supposed to ask. And yet, it's the only place this story can begin. Because every royal rupture, every irreversible shift, starts the same way. Not with a headline, not with a speech, but with a quiet moment when the people who normally delay decide to act. So let's pick up right there. Behind the scenes, the British monarchy doesn't react to noise. It reacts to patterns. One comment can be dismissed. One interview can be absorbed. One public moment can be explained away as a misunderstanding. But patterns? Patterns trigger files. Patterns trigger meetings. Patterns trigger phrases like long-term exposure and institutional risk. And according to multiple royal watchers, that's exactly what happened here. This wasn't the palace waking up angry one morning. It was the palace finally admitting something it had resisted saying out loud. That the situation wasn't stabilizing. It was escalating. Ask yourself this. Why would an institution built on centuries of patience suddenly change its posture? Because patience only works when the other side slows down. And Meghan didn't. The palace had been watching something unfold for months, maybe longer. A subtle shift in tone, in frequency, in intention. Public appearances that felt less incidental and more declarative. Moments that seemed less about presence and more about positioning. And here's the contradiction that made it dangerous. Meghan was no longer acting like someone adjacent to the monarchy, but she also wasn't fully outside of it. She existed in a gray zone. And gray zones terrify institutions that depend on clarity. Inside royal circles, there's an unspoken hierarchy of concern. At the bottom, tabloid gossip. Above that, public sympathy swings. Higher still, reputational drag. But at the very top, the point where alarms go off, is something else entirely. Narrative control. Because the monarchy doesn't just represent people. It represents continuity. And continuity cannot survive competing centers of meaning. This is where many people misunderstand what actually upset the palace. It wasn't anger. It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't wounded pride. It was confusion. Confusion about who speaks for the crown. Confusion about who benefits from proximity to it. Confusion about whether the public still understands the difference. And when confusion grows, authority shrinks. That's when advisors intervene. Now imagine this from King Charles's perspective. A man who waited a lifetime for the crown. A man who understands, perhaps better than anyone alive, how fragile legitimacy truly is. He watched his mother reign through restraint, through discipline, through the refusal to personalize power. And he inherited not just a crown, but a mandate. Protect the institution even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts. So when advisors began framing Meghan's public behavior not as a personal grievance, but as a systemic issue, the conversation changed tone. This was no longer about managing family tension. It was about preventing institutional drift. And that's when the palace stopped handling the situation and started reassessing it. Let me ask you something. Have you noticed how the palace never contradicts Meghan directly? That's not weakness. That's strategy. Public contradiction invites debate. Debate invites escalation. The monarchy doesn't escalate. It redefines relevance. And that brings us to the moment insiders describe as pivotal. A meeting that wasn't dramatic, wasn't explosive, wasn't emotional, which is exactly why it mattered. This wasn't a shouting match. It was a recalibration. The question wasn't, what did Meghan do? The question was, what does her behavior now represent? Representation is everything in monarchy. Not intention, not emotion, representation. And according to sources, the answer made several people uncomfortable. Because it suggested that Meghan's public role, intentionally or not, was beginning to exist independently of royal permission. That's a red line. The monarchy does not tolerate parallel authority. Not from politicians. Not from celebrities. Not from family. Power in the monarchy flows one way, downward from the crown. Anything else is treated as a threat. This is why history matters. Look at how past figures were handled. Those who stayed within the hierarchy, even while rebelling privately, were protected. Those who challenged it publicly were erased. Not punished. Not debated. Removed from relevance. That's the model at play here. And King Charles knows this better than anyone, because he lived through it. He saw how slowly, quietly, his own authority was shaped by what he did not do publicly. He learned that silence can be stronger than spectacle. So when advisors presented him with the reality that Meghan's public behavior was increasingly forcing the monarchy into reactive positions, he faced a choice. Double down on tolerance, or redraw the boundaries. And boundaries, once redrawn, are not negotiable. This is where titles enter the conversation. And no, not in the dramatic way people imagine. There was no talk of public stripping, no plans for theatrical punishment. That would create martyrs. And the palace avoids martyrs at all costs. Instead, the discussion centered on something far more effective. Containment. Titles determine context. They answer a silent question the public asks every time a royal figure appears. Are they speaking with authority or merely speaking? And when that answer becomes unclear, damage spreads. So the idea wasn't to take something away loudly, but to stop reinforcing it quietly. No elevation, no expansion, no defense, just distance. And distance, in royal terms, is devastating, because it changes how every future moment is interpreted. Every speech becomes personal opinion. Every appearance becomes self-motivated. Every controversy becomes unsupported. That's what an O title for you actually signals. Not punishment. Isolation. Now let's talk about timing. Because this didn't happen randomly. The monarchy is entering a consolidation era. Fewer working royals. Sharper messaging. Less tolerance for ambiguity. Every person associated with the institution must serve clarity, not complexity. And Meghan, fairly or not, represents complexity. To her supporters, she's outspoken and modern. To critics, she's disruptive and unpredictable. But to the monarchy, she's a variable they no longer feel comfortable managing. And that's the point people miss. This isn't emotional. It's operational. Institutions don't feel betrayal. They calculate exposure. And according to those close to the process, exposure reached a threshold. Now here's where things get uncomfortable. Because this decision doesn't just redefine Meghan's position. It reframes Harry's. For years, Harry functioned as a bridge. Between family and distance. Between duty and defiance. But bridges only work when both sides respect the structure. And once the palace began viewing Meghan's public behavior as independent, not collaborative, Harry's role shifted. From bridge to liability by association. That's not judgment. That's bureaucracy. Which leads us to the most painful truth in this story. King Charles didn't act because he wanted to. He acted because he believed he had to. And once that belief sets in, there is no turning back. Because every day of inaction becomes a choice. And choices shape legacy. So the palace moved. Not loudly, not publicly, but definitively. And while the public is still debating whether anything has even happened, the monarchy has already adjusted its internal reality. Meghan's future role has been quietly reclassified. From royal family member with ambiguous authority to private individual with no institutional backing. And once that shift occurs, everything else follows. Media access changes. Invitations change. Defenses disappear. And the most brutal part? No announcement will ever confirm it. Because the palace doesn't announce exclusions. It simply stops including. So when people ask, why hasn't the palace denied these rumors? The answer is chilling. Because denial would suggest debate. And debate suggests uncertainty. The palace is done being uncertain. But here's the part that complicates everything. This shift wasn't unanimous. Not everyone in that room agreed. Some urged caution. Some feared backlash. Some worried about the optics. And that internal disagreement matters more than you think. Because it reveals something critical. This wasn't an emotional overreaction. It was a calculated risk. And calculated risks always have consequences. Because once you move from tolerance to enforcement, you force the other side to respond. Which raises the question no one wants to answer yet. What happens when Meghan realizes the rules have changed? Not officially, not publicly, but structurally. What happens when the protections she assumed were permanent quietly vanish? Because the next phase of this story doesn't depend on the palace. It depends on how Meghan responds to a world where royal silence is no longer neutral, but strategic. And that response, whatever it is, will determine whether this becomes a slow fade or a full-blown confrontation. And that's where the unwritten rule comes into play. The rule that was allegedly crossed. The rule that turns tolerance into action. Because once you understand that rule, you understand why this moment feels final, and why what comes next could change everything. What is the one rule so powerful that it can end royal tolerance without a single public announcement? Because that rule is the reason this story stopped being manageable and started becoming irreversible. The rule isn't written anywhere. It's not in a handbook. It's not taught. But every royal learns it, sometimes the hard way. And once it's broken, the palace doesn't negotiate. It withdraws. Here's the uncomfortable truth most people never hear. The monarchy doesn't punish disobedience. It punishes independence. Not private independence. Public independence. There is a difference. Plenty of royals have lived privately chaotic lives. Affairs, feuds, financial messes. And yet they remained protected. Why? Because their chaos never challenged the hierarchy in public. They didn't create an alternative center of authority. That's the rule. Never appear bigger than the institution that gives you relevance. Never speak as if permission is optional. Never let the public confuse where legitimacy comes from. And according to those who follow the palace closely, that's the line Meghan allegedly crossed. Not once, but repeatedly. Now pause for a moment. This is where narratives split. Supporters say Meghan is simply expressing herself. Critics say she's undermining tradition. But the palace doesn't operate on emotions. It operates on optics. And the optic that reportedly alarmed advisors wasn't anger, it was autonomy. Autonomy without acknowledgement of hierarchy. In monarchy, autonomy is tolerated only when it is invisible. The moment it becomes visible, it becomes threatening. Because visibility reshapes perception. And perception is the monarchy's currency. Ask yourself this. Why do senior royals rarely explain themselves? Because explanation implies equality. And equality is fatal to monarchy. This is why the palace reacts more strongly to symbolic shifts than to scandal. A scandal can be cleaned up. A symbol cannot. And Meghan, whether intentionally or not, had become symbolic. Symbol of resistance. Symbol of modernity. Symbol of an alternative royal narrative. And alternatives cannot coexist with institutions built on singular authority. This is where King Charles's internal conflict becomes crucial. Because Charles understands symbolism better than anyone. He spent decades being symbolically subordinate, waiting, enduring, restrained. He knows the cost of stepping out of line publicly. and he also knows the price of letting others do so. So when advisors framed Meghan's behavior not as disobedient, but as symbolic independence, the stakes escalated. This was no longer about tone or messaging. It was about precedent. If Meghan could operate publicly without visible royal endorsement or restraint, what message did that send? To the public? To the media? This is also why the palace stopped defending. No corrections, no clarifications, no subtle briefings to clean things up. At first, people thought that meant surrender. It didn't. It meant disengagement. And disengagement is far more dangerous because it shifts responsibility. Suddenly, Meghan's public behavior is no longer seen as royal drama. It's seen as personal branding. And personal branding doesn't get royal protection. This is the invisible line that changed everything. Now let's address the contradiction that confuses many people. If the palace was so concerned, why didn't it act sooner? Because institutions don't act on discomfort. They act on trajectory. As long as they believe something will stabilize, they wait. But once they believe momentum is moving in the wrong direction, they intervene. And according to insiders, that belief solidified when Meghan's public behavior stopped looking reactive and started looking strategic. Strategic behavior implies intent. Intent implies independence. And independence implies challenge. Not intentional challenge, but functional challenge. That's enough. Because the monarchy doesn't wait to confirm motives. It responds to outcomes. So the rule was enforced. Not publicly, not dramatically, structurally. And that's the key word. Structure. Structure determines who is included, who is protected, who is elevated. And once you're outside the structure, your relationship to power changes instantly. This is where Harry's position becomes painfully relevant. Because Harry, for years, provided context. Context softened Meghan's actions. Context blurred the line. But once the palace began mentally separating Meghan's public behavior from institutional endorsement, Harry's role weakened. He could no longer contextualize her actions as internal. They became external. And external actions are not managed. They are observed. From a distance. This shift puts Harry in an impossible position. Not emotionally, structurally. Because loyalty now pulls in opposite directions. To the institution that gave him identity. And to the partner whose independence triggered institutional withdrawal. And institutions do not compete for loyalty. They assume it. When loyalty becomes conditional, institutions retreat. That retreat is happening now, quietly, which leads to the most dangerous part of this story. Because once an institution disengages, the next phase becomes unpredictable. The palace has done its part. It has reasserted boundaries. It has removed ambiguity. It has adjusted internal classifications. Now it waits. And waiting, in this context, is not passive. It's strategic. Because the next move doesn't belong to King Charles. It belongs to Meghan. How does someone respond when they realize the rules have changed? When access is reduced? When silence no longer means protection? When public behavior carries consequences without warning? There are only a few options. Escalation, reinvention, or retreat. Each carries risk. Escalation invites confrontation, something the palace is prepared for. Reinvention requires humility, something public figures struggle with. Retreat risks irrelevance, the ultimate fear. And this is why the next chapter of this story is the most volatile. Because Meghan has never been passive. And the palace has already decided not to engage. Which means the collision hasn't happened yet. It's coming. And when it does, it won't look like a royal scandal. It will look like something much more subtle. A reshaping of narratives. A recalibration of relevance. A slow realization that the ground has shifted. And when that realization fully sets in, the response could change everything. Because the next phase isn't about rules. It's about reaction. And that reaction will determine whether this ends in quiet disappearance. Or a confrontation that forces the monarchy to make its most public move yet. And once that happens, there will be no way back. What happens when someone realizes they've been moved, without being told, from the center of the story to the margins? Because that realization doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives in fragments. An invitation that never comes. A phone call that isn't returned. A silence that lasts just a little too long. And by the time the pattern becomes undeniable, the decision has already been made. This is where the story enters its most dangerous phase. Because institutions can disengage calmly. Individuals cannot. The palace knows this. It counts on it. Royal strategy doesn't rely on confrontation. It relies on human nature. Pressure reveals behavior. Silence exposes intent. And according to those watching closely, the palace didn't just redraw boundaries. It designed a test. A test with only one real question. How will Meghan respond when royal silence stops being passive and starts being purposeful? Because up until now, silence could be interpreted as fear, as indecision, as weakness. But this silence feels different. It doesn't rush to correct headlines. It doesn't soothe. It doesn't explain. It observes. That's unsettling for anyone who thrives on momentum. And Meghan's public presence has always been momentum-driven. Forward, visible, assertive. Momentum is powerful when the system supports it. But momentum without institutional backing becomes unstable. Think about it. Every public figure relies on some form of scaffolding. For royals, that scaffolding is centuries old. It tells the world how to interpret you before you ever open your mouth. But once that scaffolding is quietly removed, the same words land differently. The same gestures read differently. And suddenly, you're no longer speaking from within the institution. You're speaking beside it. That's a dangerous place to stand. Because the public doesn't always notice the shift immediately. But power does. Now let's talk about something that rarely gets discussed honestly. Why hasn't Meghan publicly acknowledged any of this? Because acknowledgement would confirm it. And confirmation is exactly what the palace is avoiding. As long as nothing is said officially, the ambiguity protects both sides. But ambiguity doesn't last forever. It decays. And decay forces decisions. Here's the contradiction that defines this moment. The palace wants distance without drama. Meghan's brand thrives on visibility and narrative. Those goals cannot coexist for long, which means something has to give. Royal watchers have noticed subtle signs already. Language changes. Tone shifts. Media allies recalibrate. Even the way stories are framed begins to change. From royal insider to former royal. From family tension to independent path. Words matter. They are the early indicators of power shifts. And right now, the words are drifting. The palace isn't pushing them. It doesn't have to. The machine runs on its own once the signal is sent. And the signal has been sent. This is where Harry becomes impossible to ignore. Because Harry's presence has always softened edges. He translated royal silence into emotional distance. He reframed institutional decisions as personal pain. But now, even that buffer is weakening. Because buffers only work when both sides trust the bridge. And trust erodes when alignment disappears. Ask yourself this. When was the last time Harry publicly reasserted loyalty to the institution? Not in vague terms. Not in emotional language. But structurally. That absence speaks volumes. The palace notices absences more than statements. And it categorizes them. Which brings us to a chilling realization. The palace isn't waiting for Meghan to misstep. It's waiting to see whether she recalibrates. Because recalibration would signal acceptance of the new boundaries. It would mean slowing down, softening tone, reducing symbolic challenges. But if she doesn't, then the palace's next move becomes unavoidable. And that move will not be quiet. It will be visible, not through attack, but through confirmation. Confirmation of distance. Confirmation of separation. Confirmation that the ambiguity is over. That's when things get irreversible. Because once the palace confirms a shift publicly, even subtly, it locks narratives into place. And narratives, once locked, are hard to escape. This is why advisors are watching closely. Not reacting. Watching. Every appearance. Every word choice. Every omission. Because patterns repeat. And patterns predict outcomes. Here's the uncomfortable truth that sits beneath everything. The monarchy doesn't fear Meghan. It fears precedent. If one person can operate publicly adjacent to the crown without deference or alignment, others will follow. And the institution cannot survive multiplication of authority. So this isn't personal, but it will feel personal, especially when the silence deepens, especially when protections don't appear, especially when criticism goes unanswered, not defended. And make no mistake, that moment is coming. The moment when Meghan expects support and none arrives. Not out of cruelty. Out of calculation. Because the palace believes that once the scaffolding is gone, reality will impose its own limits. But there's a risk here. A real one. Because people don't always respond to loss of power by retreating. Sometimes they escalate. They redefine the conflict. They widen the stage. They force institutions to respond publicly. And if that happens, the palace will respond. Not emotionally, not defensively, but decisively. Because escalation forces visibility. And visibility forces lines to be drawn. This is why the next phase of this story is the most volatile yet. Because both sides are now operating under different assumptions. The palace assumes disengagement will cool the situation. Meghan may interpret disengagement as provocation. And misinterpretation is how conflicts explode. So the question isn't whether something will happen. It's how. Will this end in quiet repositioning, a slow fading of royal relevance? Or will it provoke a public confrontation that forces the monarchy to reveal its hand? Because if that hand is revealed, if the palace confirms what many suspect, if it formalizes the distance that currently exists only in silence, then the era of ambiguity ends forever. And when ambiguity ends in monarchy, so does mercy. Because the next move won't be about behavior. It will be about authority. And once authority is challenged openly, the response will not be subtle. It will be historic. What happens when silence is no longer enough? Because there comes a moment in every long, carefully managed royal standoff when ambiguity stops protecting anyone. That moment is closer than people think. Up until now, the palace has relied on distance, on disengagement, on letting gravity do the work. But gravity doesn't just pull one way. It pulls on everyone involved. And when that pull becomes visible to the public, institutions are forced to choose between two risks. Do nothing, and allow the narrative to drift beyond control, or act, and accept the backlash that follows. This is the crossroads King Charles has been inching toward, and it explains why the phrase, "no title for you," is so unsettling, not because of what it removes, but because of what it signals. Finality. Let's be clear about something most coverage avoids. The monarchy does not strip titles impulsively. It rarely strips them at all. Why? Because removing a title publicly creates a moment. And moments create martyrs. Martyrs attract sympathy. Sympathy attracts movements. And movements challenge authority. The palace prefers something far colder. Prevention. Which is why insiders say the real decision wasn't about removal. It was about refusal. Refusal to elevate. Refusal to reinforce. Refusal to protect. That's what makes this different from past royal punishments. This isn't exile. It's expiration. And expiration doesn't need a ceremony. It just happens. But here's where the pressure intensifies. Because once expiration begins, it doesn't stay invisible for long. The media notices first. They always do. Coverage subtly shifts. Stories once framed as royal tension become framed as celebrity conflict. Sources change. Language hardens. The safety net disappears. And suddenly, every public appearance carries a different weight. Ask yourself this. Why do some public figures seem untouchable, no matter how controversial they are? Because institutions stand behind them. Take that backing away, and the same behavior becomes risky. And that's the phase Meghan may be entering now. Not condemned, not punished, unsupported, which leads to the most dangerous part of the palace's strategy. Because when support vanishes, expectations collide with reality. Imagine believing you still occupy a protected space, only to discover, slowly, that you don't. That realization doesn't arrive politely. It arrives through friction. Through moments where the old rules don't apply anymore. And according to royal observers, those moments are starting to accumulate. Not dramatically, incrementally. A missing defense here, a silent omission there. The absence of royal correction when narratives turn sharp. That's not oversight. That's policy. Now let's talk about King Charles again, because this is where his leadership style becomes decisive. Charles is not a reactionary monarch. He doesn't enjoy confrontation. He doesn't seek dominance through force. But he is deeply institutional. He believes in order, in continuity, in legacy. And legacy, to him, means one thing above all else. A monarchy that cannot be mistaken for anything else. Not a brand, not a platform, not a family business, an institution. So when advisors warn him that blurred boundaries are eroding that clarity, he listens. Not emotionally, strategically. Which brings us to the next step in this progression. Confirmation. Not announcement. Confirmation. Confirmation doesn't require a speech. It requires alignment. When the palace stops correcting assumptions, those assumptions solidify. When it stops allowing ambiguity, distance becomes fact. This is how royal decisions are made public without ever being declared. And this is why the next few moves matter more than any interview or statement. Because once confirmation happens, the public narrative resets. And once it resets, there is no way back to the old framing. This is where escalation becomes tempting. Because when someone feels their relevance slipping, instinct pushes them to reclaim control, to reassert identity, to reframe the story. And Meghan has never been passive in the face of narrative shifts, which is why advisors are watching so closely. Not to catch a mistake, but to see whether she accepts the new reality or challenges it. Because challenging it would force the palace to move from silence to visibility. And that's the moment everyone fears. Why? Because visibility requires lines to be drawn. And lines, once drawn publicly, become permanent. This is the phase where the palace stops being abstract and becomes concrete, not through punishment, but through acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that the separation is real, that the roles have changed, that the hierarchy has been reasserted. And when that acknowledgement comes, it will not be framed as conflict. It will be framed as clarification. A clarification of who represents the crown and who does not. And once that clarification is accepted by the media, by foreign governments, by institutions, titles become irrelevant because relevance has already shifted. This is the part of the story that makes people uncomfortable, because it suggests that the most devastating royal decisions aren't loud. They're procedural. They unfold through absence, through silence, through a slow recalibration of legitimacy. And by the time the public notices, the outcome is locked. Now consider the irony. For years, critics accused the palace of being too rigid, too slow, too out of touch. And yet here we are, watching a strategy so subtle, so restrained, that most people still don't believe it's happening. That's not weakness. That's institutional confidence. Confidence that the system will enforce itself. But confidence always carries risk, because systems assume compliance, and individuals don't always comply. If Meghan decides that silence equals opportunity, not warning, the dynamic changes instantly, because opportunity invites escalation, and escalation invites response. This is the final tension at the heart of this story. The palace believes distance will cool the situation. Meghan may believe distance creates space to speak louder. And those beliefs cannot coexist. Which means the next chapter won't be decided by the palace alone. It will be shaped by reaction, by tone, by timing, by choices made under pressure. And once those choices are made, the palace will respond, not emotionally, not personally, but institutionally. And institutional responses don't fade. They define eras. Because the next move won't be about titles. It won't be about interviews. It won't even be about family. It will be about authority. Who has it? Who signals it? Who is recognized as legitimate? And once that recognition shifts, everything else follows. Because the monarchy can survive scandal. It can survive criticism. What it cannot survive is confusion about who speaks for it. And that confusion is about to be resolved. One way or another. What happens when the palace finally decides that silence has done its job? Because silence isn't an end state. It's a bridge between tolerance and confirmation. And when that bridge is crossed, the shift is no longer theoretical. It becomes visible. This is the moment royal watchers have been quietly waiting for. Not because they want drama, but because this is where monarchy reveals how it truly functions. Not as a family, not as a brand, but as a system. And systems, when challenged, do not negotiate emotionally. They clarify. Clarification is coming. But before we get there, we need to understand something critical. Something most people misunderstand about how royal authority actually moves. Authority in the monarchy does not travel through speeches. It travels through recognition. Who is recognized? Who is acknowledged? Who is included without explanation? And perhaps most importantly, who is not? This is why small details suddenly matter. Who is mentioned in official language? Who is referenced indirectly? Who is simply absent? Absence is the loudest signal the palace sends. And lately, absence has been doing a lot of talking. Royal analysts have noticed it. Diplomatic watchers have noticed it. Even the press, often slow to read institutional cues, has started adjusting tone. And that adjustment tells us something crucial. The confirmation phase has begun. Now let's slow this down for a moment. Because confirmation doesn't mean a public announcement tomorrow. It means alignment. Alignment between the palace, the press, and the wider establishment. Once alignment forms, reality settles. And reality, once settled, is hard to reverse. This is why King Charles's role here is so important. Charles doesn't seek spectacle. He seeks equilibrium. And equilibrium, in this context, means restoring a single center of gravity. No competing narratives. No parallel authority. No confusion about legitimacy. That's why the next move will not look like punishment. It will look like normalization. Normalization of distance. Normalization of separation. Normalization of the idea that Meghan, the expectation that the institution will still step in when things turn hostile. When criticism intensifies. When narratives harden. When reputational damage accelerates. And when that expectation isn't met, the realization hits. The protection is gone. That realization is destabilizing. It forces recalculation. And recalculation often leads to one of two paths: adaptation or escalation. Adaptation would mean recalibrating tone, reducing symbolic confrontation, accepting distance as permanent. Escalation would mean pushing harder, speaking louder, widening the stage, forcing engagement. And this is where the palace's confidence becomes risky, because it assumes rational adaptation. It assumes that distance will cool emotions. But history tells us something different. When people feel sidelined, they don't always retreat. Sometimes they go nuclear, not out of malice, out of fear of irrelevance. And fear of irrelevance is one of the most powerful motivators there is. Now here's the part that should make everyone pause. The palace is prepared for escalation. It always is. Because escalation, paradoxically, makes things easier. It removes ambiguity. It justifies response. And institutional responses, once justified, are clean, procedural, final. This is why advisors are watching Meghan's next move so closely. Not to prevent escalation, but to see if it happens. Because if it does, the palace won't panic. It will clarify. And clarification, in monarchy, often looks like withdrawal of recognition, a formalization of what has already been happening quietly. At that point, the phrase, "no title for you," stops being metaphorical. It becomes contextual, not because something is taken away publicly, but because nothing is ever reinforced again. No mention, no acknowledgement, no association. And association is where power lives. This is why the next few weeks, the next few appearances, statements, silences, matter more than anything before, because they will reveal whether Meghan understands the new reality or rejects it. And rejection has consequences, not emotional ones, structural ones. Now let's talk about public perception, because this is where things get messy. The public doesn't follow institutional nuance. It follows storylines. Heroes, villains, victims. The palace knows this. That's why it avoids feeding narratives. But if escalation forces a response, the narrative will crystallize. And once crystallized, it becomes hard to fracture. That's the risk for everyone involved. Because once the palace confirms distance publicly, even indirectly, sympathy shifts. Not necessarily toward the palace, but toward closure. The public moves on. And moving on is the ultimate erasure. This is why the palace prefers confirmation through time rather than statements. Time normalizes. Time dulls outrage. Time makes absence feel natural. But time also gives space for reaction. And reaction is where unpredictability lives. Which brings us to the most important question of all. What does Meghan do when she realizes the system has stepped back? Does she slow down? Does she pivot? Does she challenge? Because whatever she does next will define this story. Not the palace's silence. Not Charles's restraint. Her response. And once that response is clear, the palace will act. Not out of anger, not out of revenge, but out of necessity. Because institutions do not allow challenges to linger. They resolve them. Quietly if possible. Publicly if required. And once resolution happens, there is no return to ambiguity. No second chances. No reinterpretation. Just a new reality that everyone must accept. That's where this is headed. The silence has done its work. The distance has been established. Now the question is whether it will be accepted or tested. Because if it's tested, the next move will not be quiet. And when the palace finally shows its hand, the story won't be about Meghan's behavior anymore. It will be about authority. Who holds it? Who recognizes it? And who no longer does? And once that line is crossed, the monarchy will not step back. What happens when authority stops being implied and starts being enforced? Because there is a moment, rarely visible in real time, when an institution decides that subtlety has reached its limit. And that moment doesn't announce itself with anger. It arrives with procedure. This is where the story crosses into its most consequential chapter. Because up until now, everything has lived in suggestion, in silence, in alignment. But enforcement? Enforcement is different. Enforcement changes the rules of engagement. And this is the stage King Charles has been preparing for, not emotionally, but structurally. Let's talk about why enforcement terrifies people more than punishment. Punishment is loud. Punishment is obvious. Punishment creates sympathy. Enforcement, on the other hand, feels impersonal. It doesn't accuse. It doesn't argue. It doesn't explain. It simply recalibrates the environment until certain behaviors become impossible. That's how institutions win. And if you want to understand what's happening now, you need to stop thinking in terms of family drama and start thinking in terms of systems management. Because this is no longer about whether Meghan crossed a line. It's about whether the palace is willing to let the line exist at all. Here's the first hard truth. The monarchy doesn't respond to individuals. It responds to trajectories. And Meghan's trajectory, public, visible, self-directed, was moving in a direction the palace could no longer contextualize. Not because it was wrong, but because it was uncontrollable. And uncontrollable variables are the enemy of hierarchy. So the conversation inside the palace shifted again. From observation to preparation. Preparation for what? For a moment when ambiguity would no longer be sufficient. For a moment when silence would start being misread as permission. And that moment, according to royal watchers, is dangerously close. Why? Because patterns repeat. Media narratives escalate. Public expectations grow. Pressure builds. And eventually, the institution is forced to either step forward or step away publicly. Stepping away publicly doesn't mean abandonment. It means clarification. Clarification of roles. Clarification of authority. Clarification of representation. This is where King Charles's long game becomes visible. Because Charles understands something most people don't. Authority doesn't need to be asserted often, but when it is, it must be unmistakable. And unmistakable authority doesn't shout. It aligns systems. Let's break that down. When the palace wants to enforce boundaries, it doesn't issue ultimatums. It adjusts access. Access to events. Access to acknowledgement. Access to institutional language. Those adjustments ripple outward. Media follows cues. Governments follow protocol. Organizations follow recognition. And suddenly, a shift that began internally becomes externally real. This is how enforcement looks without ever being named. Now consider the emotional side of this. Because enforcement doesn't feel like conflict. It feels like abandonment. And abandonment provokes reaction. Especially from people who are used to engagement, positive or negative. For years, Meghan has existed in a dynamic of response. She speaks. The palace reacts, even if indirectly. She acts. The institution absorbs, even if silently. But enforcement ends that loop. It removes reaction entirely. And that's destabilizing. Because reaction confirms relevance. Without reaction, the question becomes uncomfortable. Am I still being heard? That's where escalation becomes tempting. And escalation is exactly what enforcement anticipates. Because escalation creates clarity. Now let's talk about Harry again. Because this is where his role becomes most complicated. Harry has always existed as a mitigating factor. A humanizing presence. A familial link. A reason to delay. But enforcement doesn't consider sentiment. It considers alignment. And alignment has been weakening. Not through defiance. Through absence. Absence of reinforcement. Absence of visible loyalty. Absence of structural positioning. From an institutional perspective, that matters more than words. Because institutions measure behavior, not intention. So Harry's ability to soften enforcement is diminishing. Not because he failed, but because the system no longer relies on him. That's a devastating realization for anyone raised inside hierarchy, because it means the decision has already moved past personal influence. Which brings us to the next phase. Visibility. Enforcement remains invisible until it doesn't. And the moment it becomes visible, it changes how everyone interprets the past. Silence becomes strategy. Distance becomes policy. Absence becomes confirmation. That's when the public narrative snaps into place. Not because of an announcement, but because of consistency. Consistency in who is seen. Consistency in who is mentioned. Consistency in who is included. And once that consistency settles, the old framing collapses. No more ongoing tensions. No more family drama. Just separation. Normalized. Accepted. That's the palace's goal. But here's the risk. Normalization requires time. And time gives space for reaction. Which leads us to the most volatile variable in this entire situation. Public perception. The palace underestimates emotion at its peril. Because while institutions think in years, audiences think in moments. And moments create pressure. Pressure demands response. So if Meghan chooses to escalate, to speak louder, broader, more forcefully, the palace will be forced to respond sooner than planned. That response won't be emotional. It won't be personal. It will be structural. And structural responses leave no room for reinterpretation. What might that look like? Not a press release, not a speech, but a visible absence that can no longer be explained away. A protocol shift that becomes undeniable. A public moment where expectation collides with reality. And when that collision happens, the enforcement phase becomes undeniable. That's when "no title for you" stops being whispered and starts being understood. Not because a title is taken away, but because it stops functioning. Because titles only matter when institutions behave as if they do. And once the palace stops behaving that way, the meaning dissolves. This is why the next few appearances, or lack thereof, matter more than anything before. Because enforcement is measured in consistency. And consistency, once observed, becomes accepted truth. Now let's ask the hardest question yet. Is the palace prepared for the backlash? Yes, because backlash is temporary. Clarity is permanent. Institutions accept short-term pain to preserve long-term authority. King Charles knows this. He watched his mother endure decades of criticism without flinching. He learned that public outrage fades faster than institutional erosion. So enforcement, once begun, will not be reversed. Not quietly, not publicly. The only variable left is how loud the collision will be. Will it happen through quiet normalization, or through a public moment that forces acknowledgement? Because one way or another, enforcement demands conclusion. And conclusions define eras. The era of ambiguity is ending. The era of enforcement is beginning. And the next move, the one that reveals whether this stays quiet or becomes historic, will not come from the palace. It will come from Meghan. Because institutions only enforce when tested. And whether she tests it, or adapts to it, will determine how this story is remembered. As a quiet recalibration. Or as a confrontation that forced the monarchy to show its hand. And once that hand is shown, there is no return to silence. What happens when the test finally begins? Because make no mistake, everything so far has been preparation. Silence was preparation. Distance was preparation. Alignment was preparation. Now comes the part institutions never rush, but never avoid. The moment when reaction reveals reality. This is the phase where the palace stops watching hypotheticals and starts reading behavior. Because behavior is the only language institutions truly trust. Up until now, the palace has allowed space. Space to adjust. Space to recalibrate. Space to step back without humiliation. That space was intentional. It wasn't generosity. It was design. Because when you give someone space, you learn who they really are when no one is guiding the outcome. And according to royal insiders, that observation period is ending. Not because time ran out, but because signals became clear. Signals in tone, in timing, in framing. Signals that suggest Meghan does not view distance as warning, but as opportunity. Opportunity to define herself without constraint. Opportunity to control the narrative alone. Opportunity to test how far the silence really goes. And that interpretation changes everything. Because from the palace's perspective, silence is not absence of power. It is power withheld. And power withheld is still power. Until it's challenged. That's why this phase is so dangerous. Because misreading silence leads to escalation. And escalation forces clarity. Let's slow this down. Institutions assume rational adaptation. They assume people will notice boundaries and adjust behavior accordingly. But human beings don't always operate rationally when identity is at stake. And for Meghan, identity has always been central. Not as a royal, not as a spouse, but as a figure with voice, visibility, and influence. Which means the loss of institutional scaffolding doesn't just feel political. It feels personal. And personal pressure drives dramatic responses. Now ask yourself this. Why do people escalate conflicts instead of letting them fade? Because escalation recenters attention. It restores relevance. It forces engagement. And engagement, even hostile engagement, confirms power. This is why the palace fears escalation less than it appears to. Because escalation simplifies decisions. It removes gray areas. It gives justification. And justification unlocks enforcement. That's the trap. Now let's talk about how enforcement actually manifests. Because this is where most people get it wrong. Enforcement does not arrive as confrontation. It arrives as protocol. A subtle refusal here. A procedural omission there. Suddenly, expectations don't align with outcomes. And that's when people notice. Imagine planning an appearance and discovering that the assumptions you made no longer apply. No formal rejection. No explanation. Just different rules. That's how institutions enforce boundaries without ever appearing aggressive. And once those boundaries are enforced, the public narrative begins to adjust. Slowly, reluctantly, but inevitably, because the press follows signals. And the strongest signal the palace sends is consistency. Consistency in who is included. Consistency in who is referenced. Consistency in who is protected. Protection is the key word. For years, Meghan benefited from a degree of institutional insulation, even from afar. Criticism was softened. Narratives were balanced. Context was supplied. That insulation is fading. And when insulation disappears, exposure increases, which raises the stakes dramatically. Now let's address the question many people avoid. Why would the palace risk this? Why risk backlash, criticism, accusations of coldness or cruelty? Because from the palace's perspective, the risk of doing nothing became greater. Greater than public anger. Greater than negative headlines. Greater than short-term outrage. Why? Because ambiguity was beginning to reshape authority. And authority cannot be reshaped without consent. So the palace chose the lesser danger. Clear lines, clear roles, clear distance. That decision wasn't emotional. It was existential. Now here's where things become genuinely unpredictable. Because enforcement doesn't guarantee compliance. It only guarantees consequence. And consequences provoke response. Which brings us to the next likely development. Not a royal move, but a personal one. Reframing. When people feel their status slipping, they often reframe the conflict. They change the story. They widen the lens. They introduce moral framing. Victimhood. Resistance. Courage. Those frames attract support. They mobilize audiences. And they apply pressure. Pressure on institutions to explain themselves. An explanation is exactly what the palace refuses to do. So what happens when moral framing meets institutional silence? Tension. Tension that escalates with every unanswered provocation. This is where the palace's patience is often mistaken for fragility. It isn't. It's preparation for inevitability. Because institutions know something individuals don't. Time always favors structure. Emotion peaks and fades. Structure endures. Which is why the palace doesn't rush to respond. It lets reaction exhaust itself. But here's the complication. Public platforms have changed the timeline. Reactions don't fade as quickly anymore. They loop. They amplify. They recruit. Which means the palace must calculate more carefully than ever before. It can't simply wait forever. It must choose the moment when clarity outweighs chaos. That moment is approaching, and it will likely arrive through a visible mismatch between expectation and reality. An event where presence is assumed and absence speaks louder than words. An instance where context collapses and interpretation becomes unavoidable. That's when enforcement becomes undeniable. Not through words. Through experience. Now let's bring Harry back into focus. Because his position is becoming unsustainable. Harry exists in liminal space. Not fully inside. Not fully outside. And liminal space is unstable. Institutions hate it. Because it invites ambiguity. And ambiguity undermines enforcement. At some point, Harry will be forced, by circumstance, not command, to clarify alignment. Not publicly, structurally, through behavior, through presence, through silence. And that clarification will reverberate, because Harry's alignment has always served as a proxy for Meghan's status. If that proxy collapses, the interpretation becomes brutally simple. This is where people underestimate the emotional cost. Not for the palace, for the individuals involved. Because enforcement strips away illusion. It replaces assumption with reality. And reality is not always kind. Now let's talk about public sympathy, because this is where the palace walks a knife edge. Sympathy can shift quickly, especially when power imbalances become visible. The palace knows this. That's why it avoids spectacle. It doesn't want to look like it's crushing anyone. It wants the story to feel organic, unforced, inevitable. That's why enforcement unfolds gradually, so the public adjusts alongside it. By the time clarity arrives, outrage has already cooled. Acceptance has already begun. That's the strategy. But strategies rely on cooperation, even reluctant cooperation. And if cooperation fails, the timeline accelerates. This is the danger. If Meghan chooses to escalate dramatically, not incrementally, the palace will be forced to respond in ways it prefers to avoid. And that response will not be ambiguous. It will be institutional, meaning it will affect access, recognition, and legitimacy in ways that cannot be undone quietly. Which leads us to the most critical question yet. Does Meghan,